So without further ado, I welcome Professor Lin Norton.
Thank you, Alan. That was a really, really nice introduction and some powerful words there. As Alan said, this seminar series is about education in challenging times. And today I want to focus on the higher education sector, which is certainly facing challenging, we might even say dark times. And I want to focus with specific reference to the part that assessment plays in our students' learning experience. I'm delighted to have some students here in the audience today. A particular challenge I'm going to talk about is the effects of marketisation of university education. And in so doing, I'm going to draw on the writings and seminar presentations of Professor Roger Brown, who has contributed so much to this university and who is an international expert on higher education policy and quality assurance. In his latest book, Everything for Sale, The Marketisation of UK Higher Education, Brown reflects on the fall of the public service model of UK higher education, and he gives us a careful and scholarly analysis of the way that UK higher education has developed since the 1990s. And Brown has described some of the main features of this UK reform in a Higher Education Policy Institute occasional report. And one of the points that he makes is that there have been a number of moves to strengthen the role of students as consumers, supported by greatly increased information about institutions and courses. And then Naidu and Williams say that the marketisation of learning may result in passive and instrumental learners, a reduction in the range of disciplinary knowledge, and a deterrence of innovation in teaching practices. And that particular quote worries me quite significantly. In some recent research we did, which was a very large statistical survey, 2013 it was published, of lecturers' views of assessment design, we found that there was strong agreement from the lecturers that it was difficult to design pedagogically sound assessment because of student focus on grades, and also they agreed quite strongly that students were reluctant to take on board innovative assessment. So we can see that there is a really constraining effect, perhaps, on sound pedagogical assessment. And it's not surprising where students and their parents are coming from. They expect the cost of a university degree to be recompensed in the form of improved chances in the labour market. That's perfectly understandable. But this employability drive has led to an emphasis on designing curricula that focus on graduate skills, where pedagogies such as work-based learning, problem-based learning, and skills acquisition, and I'm not against any of those in principle, take priority over more liberal-inspired values such as knowledge and wisdom and criticality. And I feel sometimes we're drowning in this oppressive sea of instrumentality. And it is easy to become dismayed by this trend. But then, like all headline catchers, there's also evidence that the effects are much more complex. Tomlinson in 2014 suggests that student values in relation to their higher education are multifaceted and the student consumer orientation, which we tend to focus on a lot, is just one particular identity and value dimension. I've just read a very interesting book by Joanna Williams called Consuming Higher Education: Why Learning Can't Be Bought. And in it, she makes a point that it's not just about paying tuition fees that have positioned the student as customer. It's also a result of political and educational shifts. And when I think about educational things, I think, oh, that's interesting. The fact that pedagogy has been for some years powerfully moving against the transmission of knowledge and more to student-centered experiential learning has perhaps had the unforeseen effect of conceptualizing education itself as more instrumental. And as a huge supporter of student-centered experiential learning, this has made me stop and think. And it's at this juncture that I want to move to the main thrust of my talk today, which is looking at the effects of marketisation on assessment and feedback practices. And to do this, I want to draw on some of the research that I've been working on, or we've been working on for the past 25 years. But before I talk about some of my own studies, I'd like to make a few general comments about assessment in higher education. Looking at the origins of assessment, I found out that the noun is derived from the verb assess, which means evaluate or estimate. It also means to set the value of a tax, fine, etc. for a person or property. And the origin is from the Old French assesser and from Latin assidere, sit by. And the use of the word assessment is relatively new in the context of general education, where traditionally terms like testing, examining, and grading were used. And it was only really in the 1970s that the term assessment came to be generally associated with these activities. But to reflect on this for a moment, to assess, to sit by, I like this. This brings to my mind much more of an assessment for learning rather than an assessment of learning approach. And it also suggests to me that feedback in terms of improving learning, rather than simply improving one's mark on the next assignment, is a very important feature of our role as academics. So our role as academics, if we think about it, is to sit by students. Assessment and feedback is seen across the UK as problematic. There's a persistent view that assessment in higher education has many poor practices. And David Bowd, who is a well-known and respected researcher in the field of assessment and feedback, he's written many, many books. He's got a really useful and practical website on assessment and feedback, actually said that there's more bad practice and ignorance of significant issues in the area of assessment than in any other aspect of higher education. And then a more recent Higher Education Academy report of 2012 argues that assessment practices in most universities have not kept pace with the vast changes in the context, aims and structure of higher education. So some of the challenges there, that we now have a more diverse student body, tutor-student ratios are constantly being eroded. There's more need for direct tutor-student interaction. And as they say somewhat chillingly, I think, the student voice will become louder as fee increases bite. And the student voice is really, really important but it depends what the student voice is saying and what the student voice is arguing for. And I'll explore this a little bit further. Some of my research stretches back a long way, but I do think it's useful in this talk as it highlights the contextual background, and also it's given me pause to think how interpretations of my research findings have changed. I mean, maybe with the wisdom of hindsight, or maybe because things just do change. But ever since I started working at Hope as a psychology lecturer, I've always been fascinated by how students learn, and this inevitably led me to considering the role that assessment plays. And my very first research study in this area was in 1990, different century for goodness sake, when I looked at what psychology students thought tutors were looking for in their essays and what their tutors were actually looking for. And this was in the days, a lot of you won't remember these, but this was in the days before we had explicit assessment criteria, we didn't have marking grids, and we did not have a furor about feedback. So in this study, which consisted of a questionnaire with 98 psychology students and an interview with 6 psychology lecturers who marked their work, I wanted to ask them what were the most important criteria in writing a psychology essay. And then I ranked all the students' responses, and their top 3 were answer the question, secondly, content knowledge, and thirdly, relevant information. But when I asked the lecturers, content knowledge didn't even appear in any of their answers. They agreed with students that answering the question was the single most important thing you could do, but they also highlighted understanding and argument. So I think that original mismatch between students' and tutors' perceptions of what is important in their assignment sparked off my view that we live sometimes in separate worlds. Tutors and students are sometimes in separate worlds. But it did spark off a real lifelong interest in assessment. And here I do need to acknowledge readily and happily the 3 projects that we were involved in, government-funded projects: Assessment Plus, which was the fund for the development of teaching and learning stage 4 consortium project; Right Now, which was a HEFC-funded Centre of Excellence in Teaching and Learning; and then more recently, Flying Start, which was a National Teaching Fellowship project. And they were all about looking at students' academic writing, exploring transitions in academic writing, and looking at assessment criteria. And Liverpool Hope University has been very generous in the past as well in funding some of my earlier studies. But these projects and these work and these studies were not just done by myself alone. They were done with a huge, wonderful team of researchers and research assistants. I don't know, is Daniela here today? Hi, Daniela. Daniela is one of them, and I'm really, really grateful to the work Daniela has done. Bill is another one, and he has also contributed hugely to some of this research. This research involved London Metropolitan University, Derby University, Aston University, a number of different universities. So when I talk about I, it's not I, it's we, really. The Assessment Plus project book, I'm not sure that all of you know about it, but it is freely downloadable. It was one of the outcomes of the Assessment Plus project, and students today still find it quite useful, so just highlight that now. But as well as the book, which was an outcome, we also focused quite a lot on assessment criteria. So my drive at the time was, how do we help our students write better? So the essay feedback checklist was one way that we did this, and that has recently been taken up by a colleague at Keele and Caroline Wakefield, who works at Liverpool Hope in the psychology department. But we also ran a huge number of workshops on helping students understand and use assessment criteria. And what we found here really was that the workshops that we put on were optional, so not a huge number of students would go to these, but those who did, they wanted more guidance, they wanted more practice, and they wanted more feedback. So there's an interesting dimension here. The implication for student as customer is clear, but it's unsustainable given the finite and dwindling resources that face UK universities today. However, I think those findings show that students are really keen to understand what it is we're asking in our assessment tasks. And if we think about that, then we've got to think really closely about what we're actually asking them to do in our assessment tasks. I'm going to turn now, I talked about two separate worlds, to the lecturer's perspective on the effectiveness of assessment criteria. So we're doing all these things, we're doing an essay feedback checklist, we're doing workshops on understanding. However, what did the lecturers think? Well, we used the notion of, and I must acknowledge here my colleague James Alander, who was working at the time in Derby University, and he defined core assessment criteria as here. So they appear very commonly in assessment criteria across disciplines and institutions, and they appear to have a central role in the shared perception of what is important in a good student essay. So we call these, or I call these, the Magnificent Seven. So these core criteria. So this is what the book I was mentioning before is all about. It's got chapters on each of these, answering the question, structuring the answer, demonstrating understanding, developing argument, using evidence, evaluating sources, and when I put use of language in brackets, that really is just common facets of literacy, really. And in an interview study with 31 psychology tutors from 3 institutions, we found that they did recognize these core criteria, so they affirmed the notion that they were core criteria. However, they thought originality and creativity was missing, which is interesting. Whoops. So one thing that worried me was, do lecturers actually have shared understandings of core assessment criteria? So we asked them, what do you understand by critical evaluation? And here's just a couple of answers. But as you can see from these 2 quotes, and I'll give you a minute to read them, they are very, very different. And I think critical evaluation is one of those that if I asked every single one of you here today in this lecture theatre, what do you mean by critical evaluation? There'd be some commonalities, but there'd be huge, huge differences. Then we asked them, do you think these 7 core criteria are equally important? So do you attach the same weightings to the core criteria when marking? And again, we've got 3 quite different responses. Now, I'm aware I'm cherry picking, but these responses weren't miles away from the typical type of statements we were getting in the interviews. So for the first lecturer, was okay about appropriate language, didn't really care too much about the literacy. Obviously it was important to convey meaning okay. Their focus was on critical, evaluative comment. The second lecturer said use of evidence is really important in psychology, not so bothered about structure in an exam situation, but developing an argument and critically evaluating are done not so well by students. And the third lecturer said, well, I think they're all as important. So again, if we all sat down and we discussed, and I think it's very profitable to have fora or discussion opportunities about what we understand by criteria and how we may be privileged some over others, is an important way to go. We carried out many other studies of assessment criteria in the lifetime of this Assessment Plus project, and it was during this period, I have to fess up now, that I had an uncomfortable change of heart. I started off really committed, government-funded project, thinking that assessment criteria were the way to go. I thought they were really important. But at the same time as all this research was going on, I was still a practicing lecturer, and I realized in my own practice that when I was trying to help my students by making the criteria more and more explicit, it was actually having, what I didn't want was the effect of making them more dependent on me rather than making their own judgments. Now, I've always thought that assessment should be about helping students to judge the value of their own work, not to rely entirely on me. But what was even more worrying for me was that in attempting to help my students, I had inadvertently encouraged them to take too much note of the assignment specifications and encouraged them to perform to the task rather than my original intention, which was to get them to think and act like psychologists by looking at the evidence. And the criterion that was caused so much trouble was the one that said, I want you to use up-to-date evidence and I want you to use the journals. And I got queues of students saying, well, when you say up-to-date, what does up-to-date mean? And when you say, I want a considerable number of journals, well, will 5 be all right, or 6 be all right, or 7 be all right? You know, and this wasn't the fault of the students. This was my fault because I'd got far too specific, far too specific. So where do I stand now? I still feel very uncomfortable about over-specified assessment criteria. And perhaps that's where I went astray, by being too over-specific. My conclusions to date, in thinking about it, are that I think they are a double-edged sword. I know we all have to do them, but this is what I think about them. And I think they have advantages, but I also think they have disadvantages. Clearly, students don't have the same understandings as their lecturers. They are not, especially when they come into the first year, understanding and comfortable with the discourse, the academic discourse that we use. I mean, to use just a simple example, they often don't know what argument means, whereas to an academic, argument is absolutely clear what we mean. Okay. But what we also know, and I think our research has shown this, that students do make active efforts to improve their essay writing. Higgins et al. Came up with a wonderful term, which was students as conscientious consumers. We know that assessment criteria help to make the demands of the task clear, and we know that anything we do to make criteria more explicit and understandable to students is good as long as it doesn't go too far. It enables us to give meaningful feedback, and it gives students the opportunity to improve from one assignment to the next, though having said that, that is sometimes debatable because of when we actually give feedback. But we also know that assessment criteria, making them transparent, meet Quality Assurance Agency principles of equity, fairness, and accountability. And all those are good things. But there are some disadvantages, and these are what trouble me. They have, this is what I found, they have the paradoxical effect of encouraging a somewhat mechanistic approach to assessment rather than independent and meaningful approach to learning. I didn't want my students to write an essay and use up-to-date journals just because of the assignment. I wanted them to think like psychologists. The other thing is it encourages the student who is focused entirely on grades to use assessment criteria almost formulaically to help him get the best mark possible. And as I said before, often as lecturers, we can't agree on the meanings and values attached to these criteria. And what happens is, especially in those very complex marking grids, which I'm sorry, but I absolutely detest, but defining criteria in terms of relating to the marks results in vague statements like excellent, good, adequate, poor. And what is my excellent? Is it the same as Alan's excellent? Probably not. But if you want a really good read, read Susan Orr, who suggests that transparency itself is a contested notion. And what she's saying really is the more you seek to unpack it, unpick it, make it more transparent, the more opaque it gets. I don't know whether our students might agree with some of these things about too over-specified assessment criteria. So assessment criteria then, they seem to have come from this measurement approach, again from economic activity or capital expenditure, right far back to the 1930s. And in the earliest reference that I could find, they seem to appear within a discourse discussing the use of self-instruction materials, programmed instruction, and their fitness for purpose when judged against objective educational standards was very technicized. So this technical approach to assessment derives, I'm afraid, from the psychological branch of psychometrics, which is an attempt to measure human behaviors, personality characteristics, attitudes, and, as we do now, academic achievement. Interestingly, Steve Newstead presented evidence very compelling, because he looked at external examiners, to show that student assessment does not meet the same standard as psychometric tests should in terms of reliability, objectivity, fairness, etc. Yet we've been inundated with this move. But in diametric opposition to the technical approach is what has sometimes been called the professional approach to marking, which highlights the qualitative, intuitive, connoisseurship, expert judgment. And as Royce Sadler observes, core assessment criteria are really complex. They're connected together. You could see from my core assessment criteria, they overlap. They tend to overlap conceptually, and they are operationally correlated together. So when you try to split it out, to disaggregate them, and you're using assessment grids, and you're giving marks or A grade to this, and then you've got a B to that, and then a C to something else. But then you have an intuitive overall feel of this is worth a C, and then you have to think about whether you need to adjust the A bit and the D bit because it doesn't seem to lead naturally to the overall conclusion. However, students as customers clearly want lecturers to be as overtly transparent as they can. And there is quite a bit of evidence to show that they do perceive assessment and feedback as unfair, and they particularly see feedback as inconsistent. So we did some interviews and focus groups with students from all levels, and when we asked them about how staff used assessment criteria in their feedback and whether they thought that was consistent, they said things like this. So here's a third year who said, I don't think it's standardized throughout the college, and I don't think we've ever really been told, to be honest. Lana said that it's sketchy and all over the place for undergraduates. And Karen said it's hard to know exactly what they want. Some tutors write what they want in the lectures, others don't, so it's a bit of a guessing game, really. So this research is interesting, I think, because what we find again is that students really, really trying hard to understand what we're getting at, but often we also found they don't take active steps, particularly in the first year. These are all second or third years, but in the first year we found they didn't always take active steps. So I talked earlier about two separate worlds of students and lecturers. So considering assessment from the perspective of the academics, I like these quotes by Treed and Smith, who urge us to think about it being a critical practice which requires a certain amount of reflexivity, deliberate action, and disposition. And you can't take assessment out of the context. It's all bound about by assessment policies, by guidelines, by other requirements. And so assessment practices are never, ever going to be isolated, nor are they going to be a homogeneous activity. In my own career, I made the move, didn't always feel comfortable, from that of lecturer to that of staff developer. But in so doing, I was able to turn my research focus to academics. And increasingly then, in researching aspects of my own practice as a staff developer, my research became intertwined with wanting to impact on professional development. And one of the many studies that we carried out in the Right Now Centre of Excellence for Teaching and Learning was an interview with 30 lecturers from 4 different universities And we wanted to know, well, what were your views on assessment? And we were looking particularly, what's your philosophy of learning and teaching? What do you think are the ideal conditions for student learning? What do you think about marking, feedback? Is assessment an emotional task? And also, what's the relationship between what you've experienced in the past and your current practices? What we found, I don't have time to put up all the findings, but we found that lecturers in this interview invested considerable emotional capital in assessment, marking and feedback. They articulated a personal pedagogical philosophy of learning, teaching and assessment, but they gave competing accounts of the processes associated with assessment, marking and feedback. And by this I mean there was a difference between what Argyris and Sean have called espoused theory, what you believe, versus theory in use, what you actually do. Or we framed it in Murray and MacDonald's ideal versus actual dichotomy. So in an ideal situation, how would you like to assess and how would you like to give feedback? And in an actual situation of what you actually do, how does this transfer? So these interviews had a phenomenological emphasis because we were trying to capture the individual practitioner's lived experience and personal view. So we were trying to get inside what it was like for them. But one of the interesting aspects that stood out for me in terms of this research was that they felt that power relations, and they were sometimes talking about their power over students, and sometimes they were talking about students' power over them, often turned out to have a one-way effect of giving feedback. So they talked about lecturer as more of a service provider and students as customers. But they also talked about how difficult it was to deal with students' negative emotions when giving feedback that wasn't always what the students wanted, and that's usually a lower grade than students expect. So lecturers in our study felt stressed about marking. They were disheartened by students who did not appear to appreciate the feedback because they might have got a lower mark than they expected. And so the emotional aspect for both student and staff is considerable. So findings showed that lecturers in this study invested a huge amount of emotional capital, and they really did care about students' learning. And in an ideal world, supported by colleagues who are also on board, and sometimes colleagues aren't always on board with what you want to do in innovation, they would be engaged in a two-way, mutually positive pedagogical relationship with their students. However, in the actual world, things turned out to be a little different. So, more recently, we have explored lecturers' perceptions, I'm nearly coming to the end, in more quantitative studies in 2 universities. This was the assessment, marking, feedback inventory, and a number of you here today took part in that, and I'm really, really grateful to you. And the publication is still being written up, but it will get there, I promise. And because it would be tedious, I think, to put up the statistical findings, I've just captured a couple of comments from the open text responses that we had to this questionnaire. We've got some wonderful findings, but I think these two comments really, really express what I'm trying to say. So one was, they're both from soft applied subjects, and one was from University A. Okay. The bold is me. I've added the emphasis. I also think fear of the regulatory framework has robbed us of some confidence when it comes to assessment. Fear of the students' reactions has perhaps made us couch feedback in vague terms so we can't be caught out too. These are really worrying aspects of the way higher education is going. And in University B, this is a beautiful quote. It appears to me that the more innovative I try to be, the more stress and uncertainty is created in the students, mainly because, I think, innovation, experiment, creativity and risk are not shared currency among faculty. It's really important what your colleagues are doing. Of course, students don't like being lab rats to be experimented on. But then he goes on, or she goes on, to say they perceive themselves as consumers, not co-owners of their education. So sadly, this person is concluding that the underlying perception is that risks should not be taken with student assessment, as failure can, it is widely thought, have such a catastrophic effect on student futures. That is not what we want to happen. That is not what any drive for student to be a customer rather than a student. We do not want to react to that pressure. Bowd argues that the proper purposes of assessment have been distorted, and above all else it should support learning, and I 100% agree with him. Barnett writes about the perniciousness of summative assessment, that it cabins, cribs, and confines, no matter how its supporters may protest to the contrary. Barnett suggests that we reconceive summative assessment as enabling students to more fully become themselves, which harkens back to my original point about we need to help students judge the value of their own work. My final point then is our research has consistently shown that students and staff inhabit two separate worlds. And in the past, I interpreted this as student as novice learner and staff as judge. But I no longer think that. If we perceive our students as customers, that would bring an extra dimension that I think would move those two worlds further apart. Considering students to be our customers, of course, would provide leverage to change our assessment practices, but not the right kind of leverage. And so the pressures on us all, students and staff, are considerable. But in my view, they must not be at the expense of our pedagogical knowledge, our pedagogical experience, and our pedagogical values. Thank you.